The first thing Wade Pruitt noticed was the cars. He was sitting in his cruiser on the perimeter road of Glenwood Memorial Park. Coffee going cold in the cup holder, thumb resting against his holster in its default position, watching through the rain-streaked windshield as a black Lincoln Navigator pulled through the gates and parked along the cemetery's designated lane, followed by a silver Cadillac, followed by a dark blue BMW that still had that new paint sheen, even in the gray November drizzle. He watched all three of them settle into their spots, and then he watched the people who got out of them, and the calculation happened in his head the way it always happened, automatic, immediate, not a thought, so much as a reflex, worn smooth by 14 years of repeating it. Expensive cars, black faces. This is the Whitmore sector. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't check the county website where Glenwood's public schedule was posted, and where, if he had looked, he would have found the Doyle burial listed for 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, Section 14, Row 3. He didn't ask his partner, Danny Marsh, who was 26 years old and sitting in the passenger seat doing the math on what kind of morning this was going to be, whether they should verify the situation before approaching. He just watched and calculated and decided. Beyond the gold leaf gates, the kind of gates that cost what some people make in a year, and that communicate quietly and without apology that Glenwood is a place for a certain kind of person, the east lawn stretched away in the November fog, and at the far end of it, in Section 1428, people were gathered around an open grave. The grave was dressed the way expensive grief gets dressed. The raw earth around the edges was concealed under a drape of artificial green turf, and on the chrome lowering device above it rested a mahogany casket with brass handles, and across the top of the casket lay a spray of white stargazer lilies that were the specific flower Cameron Doyle had always brought his mother on her birthday, because he said white flowers said something that colored ones didn't, though he could never quite articulate what that something was. He had been 26 years old. The mourners stood close together against the cold men in dark coats, holding themselves with the stiff-shouldered control of people who had decided before they arrived that they were not going to fall apart in public, women who had made no such decision and were letting their tears go because the November drizzle was already making their faces wet anyway. Cameron's college friends, his graduate school cohort, two elderly women from the block where he grew up holding each other's hands, and at the edge of the gathering, slightly apart from the others in the way that people who are at the center of a grief sometimes stand apart from it so they can hold it whole rather than be consumed by it. A woman in a plain black wool coat veil lowered hands clasped in front of her entirely still. She was not the Honorable Justice Miriam Doyle this morning. She was a mother, and her son was in the casket, and Pastor Calvin Webb was halfway through the 23rd Psalm in the measured cadence of a man who has done this too many times and who understands that the most important thing he can offer is the rhythm of the words, and the fog was moving between the headstones the way it always moved through Glenwood, slowly, unhurried, indifferent to human chronology. Pruitt set down his coffee. He said to Danny Marsh in the tone of a man stating a fact that requires no discussion. "Somebody needs to find out what's going on in there." Danny said, "Pruitt, it looks like a funeral." Pruitt said, "Could be," and got out of the car. His boots hit the gravel path, and the sound of them in that quiet and grieving place was the sound of something that didn't belong, heavy, deliberate, without apology, and it carried across the east lawn in the cold November air and reached the gathering before he did, and every person there felt it before they saw him, the way you feel a change in pressure before you understand what's coming. The silence of Glenwood Memorial Park purchased silence, curated silence, the silence of a place designed to hold grief without spilling it. Broke. On the drive from the precinct to the Whitmore sector that morning, which took 17 minutes through the kind of Montgomery County roads that make you understand why certain neighborhoods cost what they cost. Wide, tree-lined, maintained to a standard that speaks of accumulated wealth rather than municipal care. Wade Pruitt had said something to Danny Marsh that Danny had written down in his personal notebook that evening, not because he was certain yet what he was going to do with it, but because something in him understood it needed to be preserved. Pruitt had been looking out the passenger window at the houses set back behind their lawns, and he had said in the conversational tone of a man sharing a philosophy he had arrived at long ago and no longer questioned. "You know what the problem is with this sector, Marsh? Nobody holds the line anymore. People show up where they don't belong and nobody says anything because nobody wants the trouble. Somebody has to be the standard. That's why they put me here." Danny had said, "What do you mean where they don't belong?" Pruitt had looked at him with the patient expression of a teacher who has just been asked something obvious. "You'll understand it when you've been doing this long enough," he said, and turned back to the window. And that was the end of the conversation. This was the worldview that Wade Pruitt carried into Glenwood Memorial Park on a Tuesday morning in November, that the Whitmore sector was a territory that it had a standard, and that he was the standard. It was a philosophy he had developed over 14 years, and 6 excessive force complaints and 3 county settlements paid out in his name, none of which had resulted in a single formal disciplinary finding, because Gary Stubbs, the union representative who had been handling Pruitt's paperwork almost since the beginning, was very good at a very specific kind of work. In the break room at the Whitmore precinct, Pruitt was known by a name he had given himself, the Standard. He used it without irony, and the officers around him had learned to receive it with the kind of surface-level agreement that is easier than argument, so that over time the name had taken on a life of its own in the department's social ecosystem, repeated with a private smirk among the younger officers that Pruitt interpreted as admiration, and that was something else entirely. He was 44 years old, and he carried himself like a man who had never been wrong about anything in a professional capacity, which is a specific kind of confidence that is very difficult to dislodge from the outside, and that usually requires a confrontation with consequence so complete and so public that the person carrying it has no available move except to absorb it. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of former athletes who have kept some of the muscle and gained other things alongside it. His hair was cut close to the scalp, not quite military, but close enough that people sometimes asked if he'd served a question. He answered with a pause that created an impression without committing to a lie. His hands were large, and his default resting position for his right one was against his duty belt thumb near the holster, not threatening in any explicit way, but communicating a constant low-level proximity to force that was in its own way, its own kind of threat. Danny Marsh was 26 years old and in his 3rd month on the force, and he had been assigned to ride with Pruitt because someone in the scheduling office believed that pairing a new officer with a 14-year veteran was a form of education. Danny had been learning things, but they were not always the things the scheduling office had intended. Pruitt walked the gravel path into Glenwood without slowing, without removing his hat, without any adjustment in his bearing for the environment he was entering, and he reached the edge of the gathering around Section 14's open grave and stopped there. And he looked at the 28 mourners and the mahogany casket and the white lilies and the crying women and the man with the Bible, and he made his assessment, and his assessment was the one he always made. He unclipped his radio. "All right, folks, I'm going to need everyone to step back from the grave and produce some identification." The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of the ceremony. It was the silence of 28 people processing an impossibility. Dr. Marcus Doyle stepped forward. He was Miriam's older brother, a surgeon. Tall, dignified, the kind of man who holds his grief in his jaw because 40 years of operating rooms have taught him that falling apart is not available to him. His voice was controlled and very precise. "Officer, we are in the middle of a funeral. My nephew is in that casket. I am asking you with every possible respect to return to your vehicle and allow us to finish. Pruitt looked at Marcus the way he looked at everyone who pushed back with the patient contempt of a man who has decided that pushback is itself a form of evidence. I don't care what you claim you're doing. We've had reports of vandalism in this section, and those vehicles along the road are in unauthorized spaces. The cemetery director designated those spaces this morning himself, Marcus said. I can call him directly if... You're not calling anyone, Pruitt said, and stepped forward directly onto the artificial turf edging the grave, and as he did, his left boot caught the base of one of the standing floral wreaths. A white and yellow arrangement on a wire stand, and tipped it sideways into the mud at the edge of the grave, and the sound of the wire stand hitting the wet earth was small and sharp in the silence, and it was the sound of something being destroyed carelessly by someone who had decided that care was not required. Every person present heard it. Something in the gathering changed. IDs, Pruitt said. Now, anyone who refuses gets cited for trespassing. It was at this point that Miriam Doyle lifted her veil. Pastor Calvin Webb had been a minister for 31 years, and in that time he had presided over more funerals than he could count, not because he had stopped keeping track out of carelessness, but because there comes a point in a long ministry where the counting begins to feel like something other than honoring, and so he had simply given himself over to each occasion as it came, trusting that words said thousands of times would carry whatever was needed if he allowed them to. He had been in the middle of the 23rd Psalm's 4th verse, and his voice had found the rhythm that grief work produces in experienced ministers. Slower than normal speech, lower in register. A rhythm that says to the people listening, you don't have to carry this alone. You can put some of its weight on these words, and the 28 people around Cameron Doyle's open grave had been doing exactly that, leaning into the sound of it, some with eyes closed, some watching the casket, some watching the fog move between the headstones with the distracted attention of people whose grief is too large to approach directly. Cameron's college roommate Darius had driven 7 hours from Atlanta without stopping and was holding the memorial program with both hands so tightly it had molded itself to his palms. 2 elderly women near the back, Mrs. Loretta Chambers and Mrs. Ruth Fontaine, neighbors from the block where Miriam had raised Cameron, women who had watched him learn to ride a bicycle and had kept cookies in their kitchens because Cameron always knew where the cookies were swaying slightly with the words of the psalm, not performing grief, but finding in rhythm what the body finds when comfort is scarce. Marcus stood 2 inches to the left of his sister, right hand in his coat pocket, left hand at his side, watching her rather than the casket, because watching Miriam had been his most reliable way of knowing how a situation stood since they were children. And standing at the edge of the gathering, absolutely still, was Miriam. She had not moved in the 7 minutes since Pastor Webb began. She was present in the complete and deliberate way of someone who has trained herself over decades to contain what she feels rather than display it, and the veil obscured her face, but not the quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of absence, but of complete presence. A woman who had gotten herself to this place, this moment, this specific patch of November earth where her son was waiting to be returned to the ground, and who was holding herself together by the accumulated discipline of 30 years of practice, at holding herself together in rooms where everything depended on it. Then Pruitt's boot hit the wreath stand, and the sound of it cut through the psalm like a blade through silk. Even the people with their eyes closed turned toward it. Pruitt stood at the edge of the burial plot, with his radio crackling and his hat on, and his hand near his holster, and his eyes moving across the gathering with the flat assessment of someone conducting an inventory. He had already spoken the command to step back to produce ID, and the command had landed in the gathering like something dropped from a great height, wrong weight, wrong material, shattering the specific and fragile thing that had been constructed there over the past 40 minutes. Marcus stepped forward and spoke, and Pruitt answered him, and Marcus offered to call the cemetery director, and Pruitt said, "You're not calling anyone." And none of this surprised Miriam, who had been watching from the moment she heard the boots on the gravel and had been measuring the situation with the precision of a person who has spent 30 years in rooms where measurement is the difference between winning and losing. She lifted her veil. Her face revealed to the cold air was the face of a woman in her late 50s, who had spent 3 decades inside the legal system, first as a prosecutor, then as a federal judge, then on the bench of the highest court in the country, and who had learned in those decades that the most durable form of authority is the kind that does not announce itself, that simply exists, and that you only understand the weight of when it turns its full attention on you. Her dark eyes found Pruitt's face. They did not move from it. "Officer," she said. And even in that single word, something shifted because her voice was the voice of someone who had argued before 9 justices and who had not lost in the intervening years the particular quality of precision that oral argument produces in people who do it at the highest level. "You have no reasonable articulable suspicion to demand identification from anyone present. We are on private property attending a scheduled religious service with the full permission of the property owners and documentation filed with the county clerk's office this morning. You are disrupting a lawful religious ceremony. You are violating the First and Fourth Amendments. I am asking you politely and without rancor to return to your vehicle and allow us to bury my son." Pruitt stared at her. He had been spoken to like this before citizens who had looked things up, who had lawyers in the family, who thought that knowing terminology gave them the same standing as the badge, and he had a practiced response to it, refined over 14 years, which was to move closer, drop his voice, and make clear through the specific geometry of his physical presence that whatever language was being used, the situation had a shape, and the shape of it was that he was the standard, and the standard was him. He stepped toward her. He said, "Listen to me. I decide what's reasonable out here, not you. And right now you're interfering with a police investigation, which means you can either produce ID voluntarily, or I produce my handcuffs and we do this at the precinct. Your choice. Make it fast." Miriam did not step back. She had not stepped back from anyone in a courtroom in 30 years, and she did not step back from Wade Pruitt in a cemetery in November, and she looked at him the way she looked at attorneys who were making arguments. She found both technically and morally wrong, with a calm and complete attention that had the quality of a scientific observation rather than a reaction, the look of someone who is recording what she sees for later use. "There is no investigation," she said. "There is only harassment. You saw a group of black people in a neighborhood where your bias has decided we do not belong, and you chose to exercise institutional authority to make that bias feel legitimate. That is what happened here. Now please, step away from my son's grave." The temperature in Pruitt's face changed the deep mottled red that comes not from embarrassment, but from the specific anger of a man who is being accurately described in public by someone who is not afraid of him, which is the most intolerable form of accurate description. He unclipped his handcuffs from his belt. The metallic snap of the cuff case opening was very loud in the cold cemetery air. Miriam heard it and made the only available calculation, which took about 3 seconds and arrived at a single conclusion: give him nothing to use. No struggle, no cry, no reaction that could be characterized on a report as anything other than what it was, which was a woman standing completely still at her son's grave, while a man with a badge decided that her skin color and her composure were together sufficient reason to put steel on her wrists. "I will not provide identification," she said, and her voice was steady in the way of someone who has made a decision rather than suppressed a fear, "because you lack any lawful basis to demand it. And if you place your hands on me, you are initiating an unlawful arrest accompanied by battery under color of law. I want every person present to hear me say that, and I strongly advise you, Officer Pruitt, to consider very carefully what you do next." Pruitt said, "Last chance," and lunged. His hand closed around her right arm above the elbow. Not the grip of a man making an arrest, but the grip of a man making a point. Fingers wrapping hard around her bicep with the deliberate pressure of someone who wants the squeeze to be felt and remembered, and who is not thinking about what it will look like in a photograph. And he wrenched her arm behind her back with a force that sent a spike of pain from her elbow to her neck and produced from the 28 people gathered around Cameron Doyle's grave a single collective gasp that was involuntary and totaled 28 people breathing in simultaneously as if the air had been knocked from the gathering itself. "Get your hands off her!" Marcus's voice low and forceful, and he was moving the controlled surge of a surgeon who has spent 40 years keeping his body disciplined and who has just watched his sister's arm wrenched behind her back at their nephew's graveside, and Pruitt's right hand dropped immediately from Miriam's arm to his holster retention strap, unsnapped in a single practiced motion, and he turned his body and said in a voice that was suddenly very loud and very hard, "Get back! All of you! Get back right now, or I will draw my weapon. Moving toward an officer during an arrest is a felony." "Marcus," Miriam's voice, not loud but with a quality that stopped him as completely as a wall. "Stop. Do not move. Do not give him an excuse. Everyone stay exactly where you are." Marcus stopped. The men who had been moving Cameron's friends, Marcus's colleagues, stopped. What followed was a terrible stillness, the stillness of people who understand the specific arithmetic of the situation they are in and have done the math and found the margin for error to be 0. Miriam submitted to the handcuffs with total physical compliance and absolute verbal documentation. As Pruitt ratcheted the steel around her wrists too tight, she noted the kind of tight that is a choice, the kind of tight that leaves marks the shape of the cuffs themselves against the skin. She said clearly, and at a volume calibrated to reach every witness around the grave, "I am not resisting. I am complying under duress. These restraints are applied with excessive force to a compliant subject. I am noting the time. I am noting the badge number. I am noting that I was warned and that this was his decision." She said it the way she dictated case notes, without effect, without the quaver that Pruitt was waiting for. "Yeah," Pruitt said. "Save it for the judge." He walked her back through the gathering, and she passed within arm's length of every person who had come to say goodbye to Cameron Doyle. And the faces she passed were not a crowd, but specific faces, each one separately devastated in its own specific way. Pastor Webb at the head of the grave Bible clutched to his chest, tears running openly down his face, and in his eyes something beyond anger, something older and heavier. The specific grief of a man who has watched this kind of thing happen too many times to people who didn't deserve it, and who has never found a way to be less wounded by it. Darius frozen with the memorial program in his hands, unable to look at her directly because looking was too much to hold. Mrs. Chambers and Mrs. Fontaine hands clasped, praying aloud in voices too low to hear the words, but loud enough to hear the intention. Miriam allowed herself one backward look, not at Pruitt, not at the people. At the casket still suspended over the open earth, still waiting. The white stargazer lilies bright against the mahogany, and the fog in the gray November sky. Cameron still there, still waiting for his mother to come back. She turned back and kept walking. At the cruiser, Pruitt patted her down without asking permission and without the presence of a female officer, and he took her small leather clutch from her coat pocket and tossed it onto the hood of the car without opening it and without looking at it, because he had already decided who she was and what she had in her pockets before he had touched either. He put her in the back seat and slammed the door. The plastic was cold through her coat. The doors locked with a sound she felt in her chest. Through the scratched rear window, she watched the iron gates of Glenwood pass on either side as the cruiser moved toward the exit, and then the cemetery disappeared, and she turned her attention inward and began to count. 7 violations. Possibly 9. She would be certain by the time they arrived. The drive to central processing took 23 minutes, and Pruitt whistled for most of them. It was an off-key, tuneless whistling, not a melody so much as a sound a person makes when they are trying to project a feeling they are not quite certain they still fully feel the sound of someone filling silence with confidence before the confidence has quite caught up to the situation. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the center console, and he did not check the rearview mirror more than twice, which was its own kind of statement. Danny Marsh sat in the passenger seat and stared at the road. He had been staring at the road with the focused precision of someone trying to make himself invisible inside a small space, and the expression on his face was the expression of a person who has been running numbers in their head for 20 minutes and keeps arriving at the same sum and does not like it. He was 26 years old, and he had wanted to be a police officer since he was 11. Had imagined the work as a thing of clarity and purpose, and he was sitting in this cruiser having just watched a man handcuff a woman at her son's graveside, and was finding out in real time what clarity actually costs when you finally need it. He did not speak, but he was thinking about the body camera on his chest, and about whether it was running. He had checked it before they left the precinct that morning out of habit, and about what the footage contained and about what that meant. In the back seat, behind the scratched plexiglass divider, Miriam Doyle sat upright and completely still. Her wrists were burning where the steel bit in with every small movement the car made on the uneven road, and her shoulder sent up a steady signal of pain that she had categorized and set aside, the way she set aside distractions during oral argument. Noted filed not allowed residents in the center of attention. The 23 minutes she used, the way she used every waiting period in 30 years of legal practice purposefully building the structure of what came next, while the people around her assumed she was simply sitting in the back of a police car. She spoke once during the drive. Not to Pruitt, to the back of Danny Marsh's head. Her voice was quiet and even, and it carried clearly through the plexiglass divider, and she said, "Officer Marsh, you were present for every step of what happened this morning. Your body camera is running. Your dashboard camera is running. I want you to understand that I am aware of both of those things, and I want you to understand that they are the most important facts in your professional life right now." Danny's hands tightened briefly on his knees. His jaw moved once, forming something, then stopped. He did not turn around, but the quality of his stillness in the passenger seat changed in a way that Pruitt, who had turned the radio up, did not notice, but that Miriam, who noticed everything, did. He didn't turn the radio up enough. The processing facility appeared at the end of a service road. Gray concrete, small windows, the functional architecture of a building designed to process rather than to receive, and the corrugated steel door on the vehicle entrance was rolling upward to receive them, and the sound of it was a grinding exhalation, and then they were inside, and the daylight cut off, and the door ground down behind them, and sealed the world out with a finality that Miriam noted, and filed alongside the 9 violations she had now confirmed. 9. She was certain about all 9. She began composing in the privacy of her mind the opening paragraph of the lawsuit, which was the most important paragraph she would ever write and which she had no intention of writing herself. The booking room of the Montgomery County Central Processing Unit was a room designed by people whose primary concern was function, and it had succeeded efficiently without warmth, with the complete indifference to the people who moved through it that accumulates in institutional spaces over time until it has the quality not of neglect, but of policy. The ceiling fluorescents buzzed at a frequency that you stopped consciously noticing after 15 minutes, but that continued to exist underneath everything, the way a headache exists before you have named it. The linoleum was the beige of buildings that have stopped caring about color. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and coffee left 2 hours too long on a burner, and the metallic close smell of nervous sweat that a room like this gathers the way other rooms gather warmth. 5 officers were in the room when Pruitt walked Miriam through the door. 2 at terminals, 1 on a phone call, 2 near the water cooler. They looked up with the calibrated inattention of people who have learned to watch everything while appearing to watch nothing. And they registered Pruitt's entrance the way they registered all of his entrances, which was as a performance for which they were the audience. "What did you bring in Tommy?" said the officer near the water cooler, a man named Birch. "Dangerous jaywalker. Worse," Pruitt said, steering Miriam toward the intake counter with the ease of someone delivering something they've been carrying for a while and are glad to put down. Refused to ID trespassing at Glenwood resisting. Thought she owned the place. A brief laugh, reflexive. The laugh of people who were not thinking hard about what they were laughing at. Deputy Sergeant Frank Okafor was behind the raised intake counter, and he had been a Montgomery County officer for 22 years, which was long enough to have developed in the patient way that long experience develops things a very reliable sense of what he was looking at when he looked at someone. Not assumption reading. The difference between those two things was something he had spent 22 years learning, and it was the most important professional skill he possessed. He looked down at the woman Pruitt was steering toward his counter. She was in her late 50s, dressed with a quiet, expensive taste that had survived being dragged through a cemetery in the rain. Her coat had mud at the left cuff. Her wrists were in steel cuffs that he could already see from this distance had been applied too tight, the skin around them already showing the early bruising of metal against bone. And she was standing with a posture that he had never seen in a booking room before in 22 years, which was the posture of someone who was in complete command of the situation and was waiting with considerable patience for the situation to understand this. Her eyes met his. He held the look. Something moved through him that he later described in his statement to Agent Kowalski as the floor dropping approximately 6 inches. "Name?" he asked, and his voice came out quieter than he'd intended. "She wouldn't give it," Pruitt said, and he tossed the leather clutch onto the counter the way you toss a set of keys carelessly from a foot above the surface, the clutch landing with a light snap against the linoleum counter. He had not opened it. He had not looked inside it. He had already decided. "Search the bag. ID's probably in there." Okafor put on his blue nitrile gloves with the precision of a man who understands that procedures exist for reasons, and he opened the clutch. He removed the items one at a time and set them on the counter, and the order of their appearance built something in the air around the intake desk that the officers at the terminals felt without being able to name it, the way pressure changes before weather. The silk handkerchief folded into a precise square initials embroidered in one corner. The fountain pen, heavy, dark resin barrel, gold nib, the weight of something made to last. The phone, face lighting up and going dark and lighting up again with the rhythm of something urgent, and the names visible on the screen in the brief moments of illumination were not the names that belonged in this room. Then the slim black bifold wallet. Okafor lifted it and paused for a moment before opening it, because the weight of it was wrong. Not the weight of leather and cards, but the weight of something heavier and more solid contained within the weight of metal that has been formally designated. He opened it. The gold medallion was set into the left panel in the way that federal credentials are set embedded, not inserted substantial in the way that things are substantial when they have been made to communicate authority rather than merely assert it. And above the seal, the text was in the crisp typography of official federal documents, each letter formed with the precision of something that does not expect to be questioned, Supreme Court of the United States. And below the seal in the credential window, a photograph, a name, a title. The Honorable Justice Miriam Doyle. Okafor set the wallet down on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man placing something that might break things if handled wrong. He looked up at Miriam. She gave him a single, small, almost imperceptible nod. Not triumphant, not vindicated. The nod of a woman who has been waiting with great patience and at enormous personal cost for someone in this building to finally look at what was in front of them. Okafor picked up the phone. "Captain Greer," he said, and his voice was 2 full registers below its normal pitch. The voice of a man who has understood the full dimensions of something in about 4 seconds and is now trying to figure out how to communicate those dimensions to someone who has not yet understood them. Get out here, right now. Do not stop to ask me why. Captain Leonard Greer covered the distance from his office to the intake counter in under 30 seconds, which was faster than his usual pace, because the quality in Okafor's voice had communicated something in the register below language. Not the words, but the frequency of them. The particular pitch of a man whose equilibrium has been disrupted by something large. He reached the counter and Okafor turned the open wallet toward him without speaking. Greer read the seal. He read the title. He read the name. He looked up at the woman standing in handcuffs 6 feet away. He looked back at the credentials. He looked at Pruitt, who was leaning against the far counter with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man waiting for confirmation that what he did was what he was supposed to do. Then Greer looked at the phone on the intake desk, and he picked it up with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that the next 30 seconds are going to determine the trajectory of a great many things. The precinct's dispatch radio mounted above the door and broadcasting county priority communications across the entire room opened with a voice that was not the standard dispatcher. The pitch was higher. The cadence was the rapid controlled cadence of someone transmitting something that cannot be taken back. And the words came through the speaker into the silence of the booking room with the clarity of something that has been said perfectly and that every person in the room was going to hear for a long time. All units, all commanders, County Dispatch Priority 1. We are receiving direct communications from the office of Governor Pendleton and from the United States Attorney General's office in Washington. Be advised, we have a confirmed report that a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States has been detained and transported by a county patrol unit from a location in the Whitmore sector. I repeat, a United States Supreme Court justice is currently in county custody. All commanders identify and secure Unit 44 immediately. Who has Unit 44? The room stopped, not figuratively. The room stopped in the way that rooms stop when something happens that removes the possibility of continuing what was already happening. The 2 officers at the terminals stopped typing simultaneously the way 2 clocks stop when the power goes out. The officer on the phone pulled the receiver away from his ear and stared at it. The coffee machine, which had been running a cycle, chose this moment to complete it with a soft, entirely oblivious mechanical click that was the only sound in the room for approximately 2 seconds. Officer Birch near the water cooler said very quietly, "Oh no." Pruitt uncrossed his arms. The expression on his face did the specific thing that expressions do when a person's understanding of a situation undergoes a sudden and total revision. Not a collapse, not a single moment, but a progressive losing of coherence, piece by piece. Certainty, going first, then satisfaction, then professional composure, the layers peeling back one by one until what was underneath was visible, which was the face of a man meeting something he had not prepared for and had no available response to. He turned slowly and looked at Miriam. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who made an accurate prediction several hours ago and has simply been waiting since then for the prediction to be confirmed. Not triumph, not relief. Something more precise than either the expression of a person who did the math correctly and is now watching the answer reveal itself and who takes no particular pleasure in being right when being right costs this much. "You said your name was," Pruitt started. "Miriam Doyle," she said. "I told you that at the cemetery. I also told you that you had no articulable suspicion. I told you that you were violating my Fourth Amendment rights. I told you that placing your hands on me would constitute battery under color of law. I told Officer Marsh that his body camera was running." She paused, and when she continued, her voice dropped just slightly into the register she used when she wanted something to be heard and not forgotten. "You chose to proceed anyway. That was your decision, Officer Pruitt. Every step of what happened this morning was your decision." Pruitt's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Captain Greer was already at the handcuff key cabinet, his hands not quite steady. He dropped the keys, once retrieved them without a word, came around the counter. Chief Raymond Bassett arrived 6 minutes later. He had been 7 blocks away when the dispatch call came through, and he had covered the distance in just under 4 minutes on foot, which said something about the nature of his alarm, and he arrived with his tie loosened and a sheen of urgency on his forehead, and he took in the scene, Miriam wrists still in steel. Pruitt backed against the far counter, Okafor standing between them, holding the credentials as if they were a document of judgment, which in every meaningful sense they were, and his face went through the same progression Greer's had, except that what replaced the shock in Bassett's face was something harder and more specific. The cold fury of a man who understands that what has just happened is going to cost his department things it cannot afford. He looked at Pruitt the way supervisors look at people who have created a problem that exists beyond the category of problems that can be solved. FBI Special Agent Dana Kowalski arrived 11 minutes after Bassett dispatched, the moment Marcus's call reached federal channels, and her first 2 questions were directed at Miriam. "Are you physically injured? And do you want to go back to the cemetery now?" Miriam considered the second question with the genuine consideration she gave everything. "Not yet," she said. "First, I need to see this handled correctly." This is what happened in the 40 minutes between the arrest and the booking room. After locking Miriam in the cruiser in the processing unit's parking lot, Pruitt had gone inside through the staff entrance, changed his vest, poured himself a fresh coffee from the break room machine on the second floor, and spent 8 minutes telling 3 officers who were ending overnight shifts and were tired enough to be an easy audience. The story of his morning. He told it the way he told all his stories, with physical animation, his large hands moving to illustrate the spatial geometry of what had happened, his voice moving between the authoritative register he used to represent himself and the mock-incredulous pitch he reserved for everyone else. The officers were tired and providing the low-energy ambient laughter of an audience that was mostly giving someone the satisfaction of being heard rather than engaging with the content. He described the cemetery Whitmore Sector Group, parked along the road. Luxury vehicles didn't fit the profile. And he described Miriam with the economy of a man who had made up his mind about a story before he started telling it. Older woman sharp dresser immediately started throwing legal language at me like she'd memorized something. Fourth Amendment articulable suspicion, all of it. He mimicked the cadence of her speech in a register designed to communicate that legal precision when coming from someone he had decided was beneath him was a form of pretension rather than a form of knowledge. The officers laughed. One of them, a man named Courtroom, 15 years on the force, who had not laughed and who was watching Pruitt with the careful attention of someone who has learned to take readings of situations, asked, "What was the actual situation? Was she a problem?" Pruitt shrugged with the completeness of a man discarding a question he finds unworthy of engagement, and he said, "Looked like trouble that needed putting down. You know the type." Courtroom did not respond. He looked at his coffee. Danny Marsh was standing in the doorway of the break room holding a cup of coffee he had not drunk and was not going to drink, and he had heard all of it. And what he was doing in the doorway of the break room was something that looked like standing still, but was actually deciding the specific and invisible work of a person who has arrived at a moment where a decision is required and who is discovering perhaps for the first time what kind of person they are going to be. He quietly left the break room. He went down to the parking lot and got into the cruiser and sat in the driver's seat. He sat there for a while. Then he took out his personal phone and pulled up the body camera footage from the morning, the footage that Miriam had told him was running that he had verified was functioning at the start of the shift, and he pressed play and watched the arrest from the beginning. He watched himself standing at the edge of the burial plot while Pruitt stepped onto the funeral turf. He watched himself standing 3 feet away while Pruitt grabbed a woman's arm at her son's graveside. He watched his own face on the small screen and saw in the quality of his expression the precise shape of the mistake he had made, which was not the arrest itself, but the silence that had made the arrest possible. He watched all 34 minutes. Then he made a list of 3 names in his phone. 3 people outside the county department structure, and sent the footage to each of them with a message that was not long. "I think you should see this." One name was a news producer. One was an FBI field agent he had gone to college with. One was a civil rights law professor whose column on police accountability he had read twice in the past year and not forgotten. He sent all three. Then he sat in the cruiser with his hands on his knees and waited for what came next, which was going to be something, and he had made his peace with that. Captain Greer removed the handcuffs himself. His hands were not steady on the key, and he made no effort to conceal this because there was nothing to be gained by pretending. And when the steel released and fell away from Miriam's wrists, Agent Kowalski photographed the marks immediately and without being asked. The dark, immediate bruising of metal applied with deliberate force to skin that had done nothing to earn it the specific pattern that will outlast the memory of the morning in the medical record, and the legal record, and the historical record of what happened in Glenwood Memorial Park on a Tuesday in November. Miriam rotated her wrists, once checked the circulation with the clinical self-assessment of someone who has learned to know her own body well enough to take its inventory accurately. Then she said, "May I have my clutch, please?" Greer handed it to her with both hands, immediately the way you hand things to a person you have very suddenly understood you should be afraid of and very deeply respect. The booking room was making the sounds of institutional machinery beginning to process something. It was not designed for radios being keyed rapid low conversations between officers, the distant sound of more vehicles in the sally port. The room's normal rhythms had been replaced by the specific controlled panic of people who understand that something has happened, and that the something is going to have consequences, and that the consequences are going to be proportional to the something in a way that none of them have experienced before. Miriam turned. She did not walk toward Pruitt. She simply turned, and her gaze found him against the far counter with the precision of something that had been tracking its direction for a while and was now simply arriving. She looked at him the way she looked at attorneys who were making arguments they knew to be wrong, not with contempt exactly, but with the specific quality of attention that sees through the surface to the thing beneath it, and finds the thing beneath it insufficient. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice calibrated to be heard by everyone in the room without being directed at anyone other than Pruitt. "You told your colleagues upstairs that I looked like trouble that needed putting down." Pruitt's face changed. "I want you to hear me say that I know you said that. I want you to understand that it is in the record now. It will be in the record of every proceeding that follows from this morning. And I want you to understand something else." She held his gaze the way she held the gaze of attorneys during oral argument when she was about to ask the question they had not prepared for. "I am not trouble. I am a mother who was standing at her son's grave, and you looked at me and decided that my skin color and my composure and my presence in this neighborhood were together sufficient reason to put handcuffs on me at my child's burial. That is what you will answer for. Not today and not to me, but to a federal court under oath with everything you said and everything you did and everything your body camera recorded laid out in front of people who do not work in your precinct and do not owe you anything and have no interest in your explanation." Pruitt's mouth opened twice. Both times nothing. Chief Bassett stepped carefully between them, not to protect Pruitt, but because Miriam had finished and the room needed to feel the completion of it, the full weight of it settling before anything else happened. Miriam turned to Agent Kowalski. "Now," she said, "I'd like to go back to my son." Agent Kowalski drove, and 2 Maryland State Police cruisers went ahead their light bars off not emergency response anymore, but escort, and the distinction between those two things said something about how the situation had reoriented itself in the past hour. Marcus followed in his own car, and Marcus's phone had not left his hand. Miriam sat in the front passenger seat this time. She watched the county roads give way to the older, more settled character of the Whitmore sector, the houses behind their lawns, the trees bare or nearly bare in the way of November trees that have become suddenly more visible, more exposed, stripped of the coverage that summer provides, and standing in the cold air, looking exactly like what they are. She watched it pass, and she did not for the first time since the boots hit the gravel. Think about the case. She let herself think about Cameron. Not the Cameron of the past 3 days. The Cameron who had become the reason for the white lilies and the 28 people in the open earth, but an earlier Cameron one who existed in a memory that arrived now without being called Cameron at 9 years old on a Saturday afternoon in the living room, showing her a magic trick he had found in a library book he had checked out entirely on his own initiative. The trick involved a coin and a sequence of hand movements he had not yet mastered. He performed it incorrectly 3 times in a row, and each time it failed he laughed, not in embarrassment, but with genuine delight. The specific delight of a child who finds the gap between what he intended and what happened genuinely funny rather than defeating. Who has not yet learned that failure is supposed to be uncomfortable. She had laughed with him all 3 times. He got it right on the 4th attempt, and the look on his face when he got it right was a look she had carried quietly for 17 years. Not triumph, but something closer to wonder, the look of a child who has discovered that competence is acquirable, and that the process of acquiring it, including the part where you fail 3 times, can be its own pleasure. She had never told him how many times she had thought about that look. She had not known then that there would be a number of times to count. She let this exist without moving away from it, which was something she had been learning to do in the hours since the cemetery, to let the grief be the size it actually was, because the size of it was not going to diminish by being managed, and the only honest way to carry something very large is to stop pretending it is smaller than it is. The gates of Glenwood appeared ahead. Kowalski slowed without being asked and let Miriam have a moment before pulling through. "Thank you for driving," Miriam said. "Of course. And thank you for not talking." "Of course," Kowalski said again and pulled through the gates, and the sound of the fine gravel under the tires was the sound Miriam had been carrying in her body since that morning, and she let herself hear it now without bracing against it, the way you let yourself hear something when you are finally ready to be in the place where you are. She walked through Glenwood's gates without an escort, without hurrying on the same fine gravel that had carried the sound of Pruitt's boots 3 hours and 40 minutes ago, and the sound of her own steps on it was different, lighter, without announcement, the sound of someone returning to the place they were supposed to be. They were all still there, all 28 of them. The men in their dark coats, the women with their handkerchiefs. Darius with the memorial program now folded and placed in his inside jacket pocket. Mrs. Chambers and Mrs. Fontaine Cameron's graduate school friends, Marcus's colleagues. Some had retreated to their cars when the temperature dropped. All of them had remained because whatever else a gathering of people who love someone does in the face of an impossibility, they stay. And the staying is itself a form of the love. When Miriam appeared at the East Lawn gate, something moved through the gathering that was not quite a word and not quite a sound. It was the release of 28 people who had been holding something for 3 hours and 40 minutes and who could now finally set it down, and it lasted only a moment before the quiet came back in. But it was a different quiet one that had something in it. Pastor Calvin Webb was standing at the head of the grave exactly where he had been standing when Pruitt arrived. He opened his Bible. He found his place. Not a new place. Not a different passage, a more appropriate verse, a fresh beginning. The same place. The same verse. The exact syllable where the police radio static had cut through the psalm 3 hours and 40 minutes ago. He had been holding it in his memory since then, the way a musician holds a note between movements, and he picked it up now without preamble and without explanation because none was needed and everyone there understood. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." His voice did not tremble. It carried. The casket was lowered. Miriam stood at the edge of the grave and watched her son go down into the earth in the way that she had been trying to get back to doing for the past 4 hours, which was without anything other than the grief itself. No calculation, no documentation, no next step. Just the grief and the casket, and the gray November sky and the small gathering of people who had loved Cameron Doyle, and who were now saying goodbye to him together the way he deserved, the way she had promised him. The afternoon moved through the cemetery at its own pace. Pastor Webb spoke the final words. The people who had come said goodbye in the particular ways that people say goodbye at graves, some with arms around each other, some alone, some with words, some with silence. And at one point during the lowering, she could not have said exactly when a single petal from the stargazer lily spray broke free and drifted down into the space between the casket and the raw earth, settling onto the turned soil below in a gesture so small and so specific that only the people closest to the grave saw it together, and held it together in the quiet that followed. By the time Wade Pruitt reached his house that evening, the story was on 4 local news sites and 1 national outlet, and the numbers on each, the shares, the comments, the digital velocity of something that has caught the current of public attention were climbing in real time with the specific momentum of things that are not going to stop. He sat on the couch with a beer going warm on the coffee table and the television off because he had looked at it twice, and both times there was his name. And he scrolled his phone instead with the quality of attention of a man who is watching something happen to him and has not yet fully decided how to relate to that fact. The comments he read a few of before he stopped because the comments were accurate in ways he was not yet ready to absorb. Sandra called from the kitchen about dinner. He said fine in a way that communicated the opposite of fine. She appeared in the doorway with her phone in her hand. She had seen the news. Not the local version, but one of the national aggregator versions with a photograph from someone in the cemetery, and a headline that was very direct, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has been doing a specific arithmetic for the past 2 hours, and who has arrived at answers she did not want and cannot unarrive at. He called Gary Stubbs at 7:14. Stubbs picked up on the 3rd ring, and the quality of his voice in the first 3 seconds was the thing Pruitt should have listened to more carefully, the voice of a man who had already positioned himself at a professional distance from the situation, who was choosing each word from a very small and carefully curated shelf. Stubbs said, 3 things don't speak to anyone who is not your attorney. Come to the union office at 8 tomorrow, and don't go online tonight if you can help it. He did not say, we'll handle it. He did not say, I've seen worse. He did not say, don't worry. Pruitt noted the absence of these things. He did not yet fully understand what the absence meant the way you notice a sound has stopped before you consciously register what sound it was. Sandra came back to the doorway. She had not brought dinner. She looked at him in the way of a person who has decided something, but has not decided when to say it, which is its own kind of saying it, and then she went back into the other end of the house, and the space she left in the doorway was louder than anything she had said. Pruitt turned off the television at 9 and went to bed. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and he ran the numbers the way he had always run them, looking for the play he had missed, looking for the angle that changed the outcome, looking for the moment in the sequence of the morning where a different choice was available. He ran the numbers for a long time. Every time he ran them, he arrived at the same place, which was the same perimeter road at Glenwood, the same 3 luxury cars behind the gold leaf gates, and the same calculation happening in his head before he had finished his coffee. The calculation that was automatic. The calculation that was not a thought. He fell asleep somewhere around 1 in the morning, and it was not restful sleep, and in the morning he would get up and go to the union office and sit across from Stubbs and begin to understand piece by piece what had actually happened, which was that he had driven to a cemetery on a Tuesday morning and handed a Supreme Court justice the most airtight civil rights lawsuit in the history of Montgomery County, and that she was, he would understand this in the coming days and weeks, never ever going to let it go. Marcus Doyle did not sleep. He had decided not to with the specific decisiveness of a surgeon who has assessed a situation and determined that a particular action is required and has committed to it, and so he worked. His home office, organized with the precision he applied to pre-operative preparation, became something between a command center and a legal filing cabinet. Over the course of the night, laptop opened 2 yellow legal pads beside it, covered in notes, organized by category. His phone within immediate reach because it had not been more than 90 seconds from his hand since before noon. He made by his own count at 3 a.m, 22 calls and sent 47 messages. He was not angry, he was methodical, and he knew from 30 years of watching his sister work that anger is a tool that cuts the person holding it, and that the most effective form of this kind of work is the kind that moves quickly and cleanly without the friction of emotion slowing it down. The first calls were to people he knew personally. 2 former law school colleagues of Miriam's who were now senior at the DOJ. A federal appellate court clerk who had clerked for Miriam 18 years ago and who answered her phone at 11:15 with the tone of someone who had been expecting the call, which told Marcus something important about how the situation was being read at her level. The deputy chief of staff to Governor Pendleton, who called back within 9 minutes, which told him something equally important about how it was being read at his. The second round of calls was more specific. Marcus was building a picture of the institutional failure that had made the morning possible, not one officer's bad decision in isolation, but the network of complaints and settlements and union cover that had allowed the same bad decisions to accumulate over 14 years without consequence. And the evidence of that network was sitting in Pruitt's personnel file in the form of numbers that should have told the story long before this morning. He requested a copy of the personnel file through proper channels at 12:30 in the morning. The deputy county attorney who received the request did not push back on it. At 2:17, his phone rang with an FBI field agent's number, and the agent told him that Danny Marsh had sent footage to 3 people, one of whom was the agent, and that the footage was on its way to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. And Marcus listened to this in complete silence and then said, "Thank you," and ended the call and sat for 30 seconds without moving. Then he picked up his pen. By 4 a.m, the unedited footage was in federal hands. By 5:30, it was on 2 national news desks with embargo requests from Agent Kowalski's supervisor. By 6, Marcus had a legal pad with 31 items on it, organized under 4 headings, and he had a coffee, and he went to his sister's hotel room and knocked. She opened the door before the second knock. She was already dressed dark trousers, white blouse, hair-back tea in hand, still steaming, and the look she gave him when she saw the legal pad was the look of someone who has been thinking along the same lines and is glad to find company there. He handed her the pad without speaking. She read through it at the speed of someone who reads briefs for a living, which is faster than most people and with a comprehension that does not require a second pass. When she reached the bottom of the last page, she looked up. "Good," she said. "Here's what we do next." She had her own legal pad. She handed it to him. He looked at the first 3 items and said, "You got to the pension contribution mechanism. I hadn't reached that yet." "You got to Okafor's intake notes as standalone evidentiary material," she said. "I had them as supporting, not primary." "They're primary," he said. "Yes?" she agreed. They stood in the hotel doorway at 6 in the November morning with their 2 legal pads, and if there was grief present in that doorway, and there was an enormous amount of it, a grief that had not diminished 1 degree since the cemetery, and that was not going to diminish for a very long time. It was present alongside everything else moving through the same space, the way grief moves when you have decided that it does not get to be the only thing. Agent Kowalski had been awake since 11 the previous evening and was running on the specific kind of alertness that serious work produces in serious people, not the alertness of caffeine, but the alertness of consequence, of understanding that what you do in the next 48 hours is going to matter in ways that extend well beyond this precinct and this county. At 8 o'clock Wednesday morning, she convened the civil rights investigation in the FBI's Montgomery County field office conference room. 2 DOJ civil rights attorneys who had driven up from Washington the previous evening, a forensic evidence specialist, the county's Office of Professional Responsibility liaison who looked like a man who had spent the night arriving at conclusions he did not welcome, Kowalski's own supervisor who had flown in at 6 and had been briefed by phone during the flight. The evidence package assembled for the initial assessment was, in Kowalski's experience, unusually comprehensive for a case that was less than 24 hours old. Danny Marsh's body cam footage, 34 minutes and 16 seconds unedited, beginning 12 seconds before Pruitt stepped out of the cruiser at the cemetery perimeter and continuing through the arrest, the drive, and the booking room arrival. The footage was clear, and the audio was good, and it contained in Kowalski's assessment, which she shared with the room with the measured certainty of someone who had reviewed it 3 times, every element of the criminal and civil case that the government would need to make both arguments successfully. Sergeant Okafor's intake notes, 11 pages, written within 20 minutes of Miriam's release in the careful, precise language of a man who understood that what he had witnessed was going to be examined at length and who wanted his account to be accurate and complete, and wanted there to be no gap between what he remembered and what the record said. Kowalski had read the notes twice. She found not a single inconsistency. The medical documentation the county physician had photographed and measured the bruising on Miriam's wrists at 2 intervals, and Miriam's own physician had done the same the following morning, and the documentation was consistent across both examinations and consistent with the application of steel restraints with deliberate excessive force to a fully compliant subject. Okafor was interviewed first, and he spoke for an hour and 12 minutes with the contained precision of a man who has been waiting some time to be in exactly this room saying exactly these things. When he reached the moment of opening the clutch, he paused briefly and then said, "I put that wallet down the way you put down something that might break things if you handle it wrong," which turned out to be correct. Danny Marsh arrived at the field office at 9:45 without being summoned. He sat down across from Kowalski and said, "I want to tell you everything. I don't want anything in exchange. I just need to tell you everything I saw." He did. 2 hours and 14 minutes. He described the drive to the cemetery and Pruitt's reasoning for the stop. He described the arrest and the walk back through the mourners. He described the break room. He described the footage he had sent the previous evening and why he had sent it. He was precise and thorough and methodically honest, and at one point when he was describing walking back through the mourners passing each face in sequence, his voice stopped for about 15 seconds. Then he picked it back up and finished. When he was done, Kowalski thanked him. He stood, then turned back. "I should have said something at the grave, in real time. I knew it was wrong while it was happening, and I said nothing. I want that in the record, too." "It is," Kowalski said. Gary Stubbs arrived at the precinct mid-morning and found that Pruitt had already been suspended without pay delivered by Chief Bassett in his office door, closed no ceremony. A manila envelope on the desk with Pruitt's badge and weapon inside before Pruitt fully understood the nature of the meeting. When Stubbs learned about Marsh's voluntary statement, he went very quiet in a way his assistant later described as like a machine that had been switched off. And then he made 3 calls in 40 minutes, and 2 of the attorneys he called declined representation before he finished explaining the situation. The third one took the case but told his associate privately that afternoon, "We're not winning this. We're managing how badly we lose." Miriam did not file the lawsuit herself, did not draft it, and would not argue it, because to do any of those things would be to conflate roles in a way she had spent 30 years believing the law should not permit. And she applied to herself with precisely the same rigor she would have applied to any jurist. You do not sit in judgment of a dispute that involves you personally, and you do not advocate in cases where your name is on the caption. What she did instead was make a single phone call to Hargrove, Webb, and Clark. The firm was not famous in the way that firms get famous by handling celebrity cases or appearing in glossy profiles, but it was known within civil rights practice with the reputation that comes from 2 decades of doing the work correctly and without compromise. 3 attorneys who had collectively argued before every federal appellate circuit in the country, who had never settled a case they believed should be tried, and whose success rate was the result of the same quality that Miriam had recognized and respected from the bench for years. Methodical preparation, combined with the willingness to be in the room for the long version of a fight. She spoke with Nathaniel Hargrove for 40 minutes. She described what had happened in chronological order, the same way she described everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "We'll take it." Her instructions were document everything, prove every claim, try it if they don't meet every term. No shortcuts, no efficiency compromises, no quiet resolution that leaves the conditions that produced Tuesday morning intact. Hargrove said, "Those have been our instructions for 20 years. The legal architecture of the case, as Hargrove and his colleagues assembled it over the following 2 weeks, was a structure designed not merely to win, but to be unambiguous. Fourth Amendment. Unreasonable seizure without articulable suspicion, documented on body cam from the first moment of approach. 14th Amendment, equal protection violated through discriminatory application of law enforcement authority, supported by Pruitt's 14-year complaint record, and the 3 settled claims that had never resulted in formal discipline. False imprisonment, battery under color of law, intentional infliction of emotional distress at the most vulnerable moment of a person's life, and then the qualified immunity motion. The doctrine protects officers from civil liability unless they violate a clearly established constitutional right, a standard that had become over the preceding decade a significant barrier to civil rights claims against law enforcement, and one that the county's attorneys flagged immediately as their primary defense. The county's lead counsel made a note in the margin of his initial case review that read in his shorthand, "QI likely determinative." He had not fully accounted for the argument that Hargrove advanced. The argument was not that Miriam was more deserving of legal protection by virtue of her identity. It was that the law Pruitt violated was so precisely and so recently articulated by the court on which she served that no officer of reasonable competence could credibly claim ignorance of it. She had joined majority opinions in 4 cases over the preceding decade, opinions that Hargrove cited by name and page number in the immunity motion that had defined with exceptional clarity the precise constitutional standards that Pruitt had violated within the first 45 seconds of approaching the grave. The federal judge assigned to the case read the immunity motion. He took 11 days. He stripped the immunity on all counts. This exposed Pruitt personally, his savings, his pension, his house held jointly with Sandra, his truck to damages alongside the county's institutional liability, and the county, which had done its own math, had a very powerful incentive to resolve the civil matter before it became a public trial. They opened settlement discussions 8 days after the lawsuit was filed. Miriam's instruction to Hargrove when the first contact came through, "The number starts at 20 million. The Cameron Doyle Foundation is non-negotiable. Pruitt's pension is non-negotiable. We don't trade either one for a higher number." Hargrove relayed this to the county's lead attorney, a man named Patterson, who had practiced municipal liability defense for 23 years and who, after receiving the message, sat at his desk for a moment and said to his junior associate, "This is going to settle, and when it does, it is not going to feel like winning." He was correct. 2 weeks into the suspension, Wade Pruitt had developed a new and unwelcome relationship with time, which was that there was too much of it, and none of it was the right shape. The time he had previously had was structured, time organized by shifts and duties, and the daily confirmation of authority that comes with being the person who decides what is and is not permissible within a given territory, and the removal of that structure had left him in a formless expanse of hours that he did not know how to inhabit. He drove the neighborhood, not toward anything, just moving the way people move when stillness feels like a failure of nerve. He had retained an attorney named Calvin Dodd, a sole practitioner who had taken the case because two more prominent firms had declined it, and because Dodd had spent 20 years taking cases other people wouldn't, which had given him a reputation more admirable than lucrative, and a professional philosophy that required honesty with clients, even when honesty was the thing clients were least interested in hearing. In their first meeting, Dodd told Pruitt plainly that the evidentiary picture was not favorable, and that the best available path was genuine cooperation in the civil proceedings, in the hope that cooperation might influence the eventual criminal process. Pruitt had nodded. He had not agreed. Gary Stubbs met with him twice in the first 2 weeks, and both meetings had the quality of the first phone call. The quality of professional management rather than personal alliance, an administrator conducting a necessary process rather than a friend sharing a strategy. The union would not fund the legal defense beyond the initial consultation, Stubbs said in the second meeting with the careful language of someone delivering news that is also a legal position, and the reasons he gave were procedural and technically correct, and communicated unmistakably that Pruitt was going to navigate this alone. Sandra had not left, but Sandra was somewhere else. She was in the house moving through the same rooms, but in a version of the house that had a different interior climate, colder in ways that had nothing to do with the November temperature outside, and quieter in ways that had nothing to do with the volume of what was being said. She had been doing her own arithmetic since the first evening, and she had arrived at a set of answers she had not yet communicated to him directly, and the not yet of it was more frightening to him than any of the formal proceedings. His son texted once 3 words, "Dad, what happened?" And Pruitt started a reply 17 times and sent none of them because none of them answered the question honestly, and he was not yet in a place where honesty was available to him. On a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks into the suspension, Pruitt drove out to Glenwood. He could not have told you exactly why. He told himself he was in the neighborhood, which was technically true. He told himself there was nothing deliberate about it. But when the cast iron gates appeared ahead of him on the perimeter road, the gold leaf name, the hedgerows, the long east lawn stretching away into the November fog, he slowed the truck to nearly stopping and looked through the bars at the cemetery. He could not see Section 14 from the road. The hedgerows blocked it. He sat there for almost 2 minutes with the engine idling, looking at the gate, and then he drove home. That night alone in the kitchen while Sandra was at the far end of the house and the television in the living room was showing something that contained his name. He had stopped watching it 2 days ago but had not turned it off, so the light from it continued to move on the hallway wall. Pruitt sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal he had made because the refrigerator offered nothing easier, and he ate it slowly, and he thought about the cemetery, not the legal dimensions of it, not the process, not the complaints, not the footage, not what Dodd had said about cooperation. He thought about the woman standing at the grave before he had walked up the path, the way she held herself, not hunched, not collapsed, but rooted the specific posture of someone bearing an enormous amount of weight with the accumulated practice of someone who has borne weight before and has learned where in the body to carry it so it doesn't break you. He had looked at that, and he had walked up the path anyway. He had looked at a woman standing at her child's grave in the cold November rain, and he had calculated what she was, and the calculation had been automatic. And the automatic nature of it was the thing he was beginning to circle around without quite being able to approach directly, because approaching it directly would require him to acknowledge something about himself that 14 years of being the standard had made it very difficult to acknowledge. He finished his cereal. He went to bed. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. He was beginning to understand the shape of what he had done. He was not yet in the same room as it, but he could feel it from where he was, and it was very large. The Department of Justice filed federal criminal charges against Wade Pruitt on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the arrest under 18 U.S.C. Section 242 deprivation of rights under color of law in 2 counts. The first for the unlawful seizure and arrest of a citizen without probable cause or reasonable articulable suspicion. The second for the battery committed during that arrest, documented on body cam footage medical record, and the testimony of 28 witnesses. The charging documents were 31 pages long and were written with the economy of language that serious federal prosecutors bring to serious federal cases: no extra words, no rhetorical elevation, just the sequence of facts assembled with the precision of an argument that has already been constructed and needs only to be stated. The indictment unsealing was conducted outside the courthouse, and Agent Kowalski read the public statement in the flat, informational tone of an official who understands that the occasion does not require theater. Miriam was not there. She was in Washington in the courtroom at the top of the building she had worked in for 11 years, presiding over oral argument in a municipal liability case. One she had not recused herself from because she was not a party to it, and her personal experience was not, in her considered judgment, grounds for recusal, though she had disclosed the situation to the court in the standard manner, and her colleagues had confirmed her participation was appropriate. She sat at the center of the bench in her robes and asked 2 questions during the argument, both short, both precise, both of them moving the argument in a direction that was visible to everyone in the room. Then she returned to her chambers and reviewed the next day's briefs. Pruitt was arraigned that same afternoon. He appeared in the federal courtroom in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a gray sport coat, slightly too large in the shoulders, the fit of a man who bought clothes in a different body and is wearing them in the body that recent months have produced. He was 44 years old and looked older than that in the specific way that certain kinds of sustained pressure ages people not from the outside in, but from the inside out, a hollowing that shows first in the eyes and then in everything else. He pleaded not guilty in a voice that was technically audible and did not reach the gallery. His attorney, Calvin Dodd, made 2 arguments at the arraignment, one on the body cam footage's chain of custody, and one on the characterization of probable cause in the charging document, and the federal judge, the Honorable Arthur Pennington, addressed both with the calm efficiency of a man who has heard these arguments before on different facts and finds them unpersuasive on the current facts. Pennington's efficiency contained no contempt, but also no warmth, and Dodd sat down with the expression of a man who is continuing to do his job and has made an honest private assessment of where his job is taking him. Bail was set at Pruitt's own recognizance. He was not a flight risk, with the conditions that his passport be surrendered and that he have no contact with any witness in the matter. He walked out of the courthouse into the November air with Dodd beside him, and the cameras were there, and he walked through them without speaking, with the specific quality of movement of a man who has spent 14 years cultivating a certain kind of public presence, and who has discovered that the presence is no longer available to him in its original form. He drove home in his truck. The truck that the county's asset forfeiture review had already begun processing, though nobody had told him that yet. The civil case settled on a Tuesday, 6 weeks before the criminal trial was scheduled to begin, which meant it settled on a Tuesday in February, 3 months and 11 days after the arrest. And Miriam noted that it was a Tuesday the way she had noted the Tuesdays throughout the Tuesday of the arrest, the Tuesday of the arraignment, the Tuesday her son had died. Tuesdays in this chapter of her life had a particular weight that she had stopped trying to explain. There had been 2 negotiating sessions. The first lasted 3 hours and was conducted largely by Patterson, the county's lead counsel, and Nathaniel Hargrove, and it ended without a number on the table but with a shared and accurate understanding of the range of the conversation. The second lasted 90 minutes, and by the end of it there was a number $18,300,000 agreed by both parties subject to the terms Miriam had given Hargrove in November and that Hargrove had declined to modify regardless of what was offered in exchange. Every dollar of the $18,300,000 was to go into the Cameron Doyle Foundation for Justice, a nonprofit established to provide free legal representation to minority victims of police abuse across the state of Maryland, with a secondary mandate to support policy reform and law enforcement accountability at the county and state level. The county was additionally required to implement mandatory on-body camera policies across all patrol units, establish an independent community oversight board with binding investigative authority, and submit to a 2-year compliance review by a federal monitor. Pruitt's personal exposure, the consequence of the stripped qualified immunity, was assessed at $280,000, representing the liquidation of his savings accounts, his entire police pension fund, and the truck that the forfeiture review had determined was purchased with salary funds from the years in which his conduct was under review. Patterson signed the document at 3:47 in the afternoon. Hargrove called Miriam at 3:52. She was not in her office. She was at Glenwood, standing at Cameron's grave, which she had been doing with some regularity since the burial. Not always for long, sometimes just long enough to stand there in the specific quality of quiet that the east lawn had at this hour in the late afternoon, with the fog beginning to settle and the light going amber and the manicured hedgerows doing what they were designed to do, which was to hold a space apart from the world so that what needed to happen in it could happen. She answered the phone. She listened to Hargrove say the number, confirm the terms, confirm the signatures. She said, "Thank you, Nathaniel," and ended the call and put the phone back in her coat pocket. She stood at the grave for 20 more minutes. She had brought flowers, white stargazer lilies again, and she had laid them at the base of the stone, which was granite and low. Cameron's name and dates in simple carved letters, and beneath them, at her instruction, a single line: "I want to make the spaces people live in kinder." From a letter he had written her at 15, after a summer of volunteer work in their old neighborhood. She had kept the letter. She had always kept everything he wrote. Marcus was in the conference room when Patterson signed. He had sat through both negotiating sessions at Hargrove's invitation, saying nothing, present only as what he was, which was the brother of the plaintiff and the uncle of the young man whose name was on the foundation. When Patterson slid the signed document across the table, Marcus reached into his jacket and removed a fountain pen, a pen Cameron had given him for Christmas because he had noticed that Marcus still wrote by hand, and he uncapped it, held it for a moment, and then recapped it and put it back without using it. He looked at Patterson across the table and said, "My nephew was going to be an architect. He had 214 drawings. He wanted to redesign public spaces so they treated people better, especially the people who had historically been given the worst of everything. None of those drawings will be built." He stood and buttoned his coat. "The foundation will do that work instead," he said, "in every county in this state." He picked up his briefcase and left the room, and Patterson sat with the signed document in front of him and felt for the first time in the proceedings the full weight of what this had actually been about. The trial opened on a Monday in March before Judge Arthur Pennington, a man whose reputation in the federal bar had been built over 23 years of presiding over difficult cases with the combination of patience and absolute zero tolerance for evasion that made him the choice that federal prosecutors preferred and the outcome that defense counsel calculated carefully around. The gallery was full on opening day and stayed full all 3 days. Press, community members, legal observers from 3 law schools. The simply curious, because this was a trial that had moved through the public consciousness in the months since November, from a news event into something that felt more like a reckoning, a moment when a question that had been circulating for a long time about who the law protected and who it was deployed against was going to be answered in the specific language of federal criminal proceedings. The prosecution opened with 11 minutes that were notable for what they omitted as much as what they included. No rhetorical elevation, no appeal to history or symbol. Just this: a mother was burying her son in a cemetery on a Tuesday morning. An officer drove up, made a decision based on what he saw rather than on what was happening, and took her from her son's graveside in handcuffs. Everything that follows is the documentation of that decision and its consequences. The body cam footage was played in full on day one, all 34 minutes and 16 seconds on a screen large enough for the back row of the gallery to see every expression on every face with clarity. The courtroom went completely still during the playback, in the way that rooms go still when they are being shown something that does not require commentary. A juror in the second row closed her eyes at the moment Pruitt's boot nudged the funeral wreath into the mud. She did not open them again until Miriam's voice came through the speakers. "I am not resisting. I am complying under duress." Steady and precise and devastating in its steadiness, the voice of a woman creating a record from inside a situation that should not have been happening. The juror opened her eyes and looked not at the screen but at Pruitt, and the look she gave him was the look of someone who has been shown an answer to a question she had been carrying for a long time. Danny Marsh was the prosecution's second witness. He had left the Montgomery County Department 4 months earlier, and he came to the stand in civilian clothes with the bearing of someone who has made a decision that cost him significantly, and who has found in the making of it something he needed that he did not previously have. He testified in chronological order, precisely and without evasion, and when the prosecutor asked whether he had believed in real time at the cemetery that the arrest was lawful, Marsh was quiet for 4 seconds and then said, "No, I believed it was wrong. I said nothing. That is the worst decision of my professional life, and I will carry it." Dodd's cross-examination produced no significant inconsistencies, because there were none available to produce. Pruitt's defense occupied less time than expected. Dodd argued that his client had acted on a genuine, if mistaken, perception of suspicious activity, that the standard for officer judgment in the field required context, the footage did not fully capture, and that a criminal finding was not the appropriate remedy for what was at its core an error of assessment. The prosecution's cross-examination of Pruitt was conducted by Angela Reyes, who approached the podium with a single page of notes, and a voice pitched slightly quieter than the room required, so that everyone had to lean slightly in to hear, and each question was simple and factual, and built on the previous one, with the methodical patience of a person who knows exactly where she is going. Did you check the cemetery's public schedule before approaching? No. Did you contact dispatch to verify a permitted service? No. Did you examine the victim's personal property before transport? None. Did you know at the time of arrest who Miriam Doyle was? Number Officer Pruitt, you told your colleagues that morning that you were the standard in the Whitmore sector. You told your partner on the drive to the cemetery that somebody had to hold the line that people show up where they don't belong and nobody says anything. Is that accurate? Pruitt said, "I was talking about the job." You had available to you in the moment before your approach multiple tools that would have given you accurate information about what you were looking at, Reyes said. You used none of them. You proceeded on the basis of a visual assessment of the people you saw. You applied what you called a standard. Is that correct? Pruitt's answer, "I acted on what I observed." "Yes," Reyes said. "The jury has observed the same footage." She gathered her notes. No further questions. Miriam testified on the afternoon of the third day. She walked to the witness stand with the same measured step she used. Everywhere took the oath and sat with the posture she held on the bench straight back, hands folded, face attentive. She wore a dark suit and the same plain watch she always wore, and she looked to the jury and to the gallery like a person who has come to give accurate information rather than to perform anything. She described the morning of the arrest in chronological order, beginning with her arrival at Glenwood at 9:42. She described the sound of the boots on the gravel before she could see who was coming. She described the wreath being knocked into the mud. She described the command to produce identification and the legal basis on which she declined it. She described the grip on her arm, the specific pressure of it, the deliberate quality of it, the way it was designed not merely to restrain, but to communicate. And she described the handcuffs applied too tight, and the words she said out loud in front of 28 witnesses to create a record that could not be disputed. Then she said, "And I looked back at my son's casket before they put me in the car. He was still above the ground. He had not been buried yet. I was taken away before I could finish burying him." She said it without effect, without the quaver, with the precision of someone giving accurate testimony. And in that absence of effect, the weight of what had been said was more present than it would have been with any amount of emotion, because the jury understood in the silence that followed that it had cost her something very significant to say it that way, and the significance of what it had cost was itself a kind of testimony. The prosecutor had no additional questions. Dodd stood for cross-examination. He stood for perhaps 20 seconds, looking at his notes. Then he said, "No questions, Your Honor." Pennington gave him 30 seconds to reconsider. Dodd shook his head. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 18 minutes. Guilty on both counts. The courtroom received the verdict in the specific silence of a room in which sustained tension has just completed its resolution. Not celebration, not mourning, but the silence of people who have witnessed an institutional process arrive at the answer it was built to arrive at, and who have not been certain until this moment that it would. Miriam was in the third row in her dark coat. When the verdict was read, she looked at the jury. 3 of the jurors looked back at her. She gave them a single small nod, the nod of someone who has seen the work done and who knows what the work cost the people who did it. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks after the verdict on an April morning, and the spring light through the high courthouse windows was so different from the November gray of everything that had preceded it that several people in the gallery noticed the quality of it. Specifically, the particular brightness of a different season inside a room that had held difficult things, the contrast of it registering as something almost physical. Pennington took the bench at 9 o'clock, and the room settled immediately. Pruitt stood. He was in the same gray sport coat from the arraignment, or one very similar. And what 5 months of this process had produced in him was visible in the way these things become visible, not all at once, but accumulated the weight of it having reorganized itself from the inside out. He was not the man who had walked the cemetery path with his thumb near his holster and his chest forward. He was something that had been reduced from that to its actual dimensions, which were considerably smaller, and the reduction was visible in his posture and in the quality of his eyes, and in the specific way he held his hands, which was together in front of him, not reaching for anything. Dodd read the statement on Pruitt's behalf. It acknowledged impact. It mentioned family and years of service. It expressed remorse of the kind that is genuine in the sense that any person facing this situation experiences remorse. The remorse that comes from consequence rather than from having fully understood what you did and why it mattered. And these 2 kinds of remorse are not the same thing, and Pennington, who had been listening to statements in his courtroom for 23 years, knew the difference between them with precision. Marcus rose to deliver the victim impact statement. He read from a prepared document in the manner of a man who has written it himself and who carries its content in him regardless of the paper in his hands. He did not describe the family's suffering. He described Cameron. Cameron at 7, who asked why about everything, not in the way of a child seeking attention, but in the way of a mind that genuinely could not rest until it had an answer, and that immediately needed the next question the moment it had one. Cameron at 16, who had taken apart a bicycle and rebuilt it in a different configuration, purely to discover whether it functioned differently, and who had been delighted to find that it did. Cameron at 22, spreading his first real architectural drawings across the kitchen table, not buildings exactly, but spaces designed around the premise that the people who needed public spaces most were the ones who had historically received the least consideration in their design, and that this was something that could be changed if the right person decided to change it. He had 214 drawings, Marcus said. He had just been admitted to a graduate architecture program. He was going to spend his life making the places where people live kinder to the people who live in them. He paused. He was 26 years old. Those drawings will not be built. He folded the statement and sat down. Pennington looked at Miriam. "Justice Doyle, does the victim wish to address the court?" Miriam stood. She said 9 words. "Your Honor, I trust this court to do its work." She sat down. Pennington was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to register as deliberate. Then he adjusted his reading glasses and looked at Pruitt and began to speak, and the room listened with the quality of attention that rooms give to words that are going to matter. He spoke about the oath and what it requires in practice, not abstractly, but in the specific terms of what occurred in Section 14 of Glenwood Memorial Park on a Tuesday morning in November. He said, "You saw a woman at a grave. Before you had any information about who she was, before you had checked any schedule or made any inquiry or taken any step to understand what you were looking at, you made a determination. You made it the way you told your partner you always made it, by looking at who was in front of you and deciding whether they belonged. And then you proceeded from that determination with the full authority of the state behind you." He paused. "That is not a split-second decision made under pressure. That is a practice. And you practiced it on a mother who was trying to bury her son." He said the word deliberate 3 times in the course of his statement, each time in a slightly different context, and each time it landed with slightly more weight than the time before. 54 months in federal custody. Your police pension is stripped in its entirety. You are permanently prohibited from any law enforcement role or any position of public authority at any level of government for the remainder of your life. He picked up his gavel. Pruitt's hand moved to the defense table, not dramatically, not a collapse, just the reaching of a person whose body has registered something large before the mind has completed processing it. His legs found the edge of the chair. Dodd moved closer. The marshals approached from the left, and as they came, Pruitt turned and looked one last time at the gallery, not at Miriam. At the seat beside her, which was where Sandra had sat every day of the trial, and where she had not sat today, because today she had not come, and the empty seat was the specific shape of something he had not understood the value of until after he had lost it, which is the only time most people understand the value of anything. The marshals walked him toward the door. His legs moved him through it. The door closed behind him with the sound of a federal door that does not open from the inside, and the sound of it settled into the courtroom and then into the silence that followed, which was the particular silence of something that has finally been completed. In the 3rd row, Miriam sat still, her hands folded in her lap, and watched the door. The Federal Correctional Institution at Cumberland sat in a western Maryland valley between 2 ridges, and on clear days the sky above the exercise yard was the particular deep blue of late autumn and winter afternoons, wide and clean and entirely indifferent to the people below it. And Pruitt had been watching that sky for 6 months, and had arrived at the understanding that beauty does not require your permission to exist, and that indifference is not the same as absence. His cell was 8 by 10, top bunk assigned. A small shelf held 3 books Dodd had brought at the first legal visit, and Pruitt had read each of them twice, not because he particularly loved them, but because reading occupied enough of his attention to give the rest of his mind temporary relief from the accounting it continued to do without his consent. The accounting was this: what he had had and what he did not have now, and the precise measurement of the distance between those 2 states. He had had a title and a territory, and the daily confirmation of authority that comes with being the person who decides what is and is not acceptable in a given stretch of geography. He had had a house with a yard and a truck, and a wife who cooked dinner, and a schedule that told him what he was for. He had had a version of himself that was coherent and functional, and that he had maintained for 44 years with considerable effort, and the version he was beginning to understand with the slow and resistant understanding of a person who has been accurate about very few things was not the same as accurate. Sandra's letter arrived on a Thursday 4 months in. 2 pages. No anger, no accusation, no warmth. Not because she had none, but because the letter was not written to convey feeling, but information. Her work at the district office. The Wednesday church service she had resumed. The refrigerator repair she had handled. The eldest's graduation. The youngest's phone call. The letter ended with her name, and nothing after it. And the nothing after it communicated more than any of the preceding information. He read it 3 times, folded it, and put it in the envelope that served as his file. He thought about the cemetery with a quality of attention that had changed over 6 months. Not the desperate review he had run in the first weeks looking for the angle that changed the outcome. Running the same play over and over until it came out different, which it never did. That review had run its course and deposited him at the same place every time, which was the same perimeter road at Glenwood, the same 3 cars behind the gates, and the same calculation happening in his head before he had consciously decided to make it. The calculation that was automatic. The calculation that was the practice Pennington had named in court, and that Pruitt had spent 6 months trying to look at, directly the way you try to look at something very bright, approaching it from the side in increments, because looking at it directly too quickly burns. He was getting closer. Not there yet, but closer. On a Tuesday afternoon, 8 months into his sentence, a corrections officer brought him to a table in the common room where there was a standard form, a legal aid application filed by a 23-year-old in the unit who had a hearing in 6 weeks and no counsel and no understanding of how to fill out the paperwork that might get him one. Pruitt sat down. He knew how bureaucratic paperwork worked. The young man did not. So Pruitt walked him through it, what went in each field, what the deadlines meant, which section needed the most specific language. It took 40 minutes. He did not think while he was doing it about what it meant. He did not frame it for himself as anything. He just did it because it was something that could be done, and doing it was marginally better than not doing it, and that was the full extent of what he was able to say about it at this point in his life. One day, that might change. He did not know yet. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived through the facility's official mail channel, addressed to him by name and inmate number, return address, a law office in Montgomery County. He assumed it was something procedural, an administrative notice in the ongoing civil aftermath, and he opened it with the flat attention of a man who has learned to process bad news without flinching. It was not procedural. It was not. It was a 1-page notice from Hargrove Webb and Clark sent as required by the terms of the settlement agreement to all parties and former department employees of record advising of the formal commencement of operations of the Cameron Doyle Foundation for Justice. The letter described the foundation's mandate. It described its first case, a man named Darnell Reeves, who had been arrested without cause in Prince George's County, who had spent 11 days in pretrial detention, who had lost his job and his apartment during the adjudication period, and who had been released when charges were dropped, and who had now, with the Foundation's representation, had his record fully cleared and had been reinstated at his former employer with back pay. At the bottom of the page, in a separate section, a single line noting that the Foundation's operational budget was funded in part by the civil settlement, including the liquidation of the pension and personal assets of former officer Wade Pruitt. The pension he had paid into for 14 years. The pension that was now paying for Darnell Reeves to have his life back. Pruitt sat at the table in the common room with the letter in his hands, and he read it 3 times. And then he folded it and put it in the pocket of his uniform. And he sat there for a long time without moving, holding something he did not yet have the language to name, but that was sitting in his chest with the specific weight of a thing that is true and cannot be undone, and that you're going to have to live alongside for the rest of your life. The young man at the next table said, "You okay, man?" Pruitt said, "Yeah." He was not. The Cameron Doyle Foundation for Justice opened its first office in March, 11 months after the settlement, in a renovated row house on Clement Street in the part of Montgomery County where Miriam had raised Cameron 2 blocks from his elementary school. 4 blocks from the park where he had learned to ride a bicycle, half a mile from the church where Pastor Calvin Webb still presided every Sunday morning. The row house had been a law office in a previous incarnation, and before that a family home, and it had been renovated with attention to what it was going to be, rooms that were functional without being institutional, natural light, wherever the architecture permitted. Good chairs in the waiting area, a children's corner with books and drawing materials because many of the people who were going to use these services were going to bring their children, and the children's experience of the place mattered. No elected officials had been invited. No press releases issued in advance. No ribbon cutting. The guest list was Marcus Pastor Webb Cameron's closest friends from college and graduate school, the attorneys from Hargrove, Webb, and Clark, Agent Kowalski, Danny Marsh, Sergeant Okafor, who had driven 45 minutes and arrived early, and approximately 40 members of the community who had already submitted applications. Miriam spoke for 4 minutes. She did not speak about the lawsuit or the settlement or the trial or anything that had happened in the month since November. She spoke about Cameron, the specific. Cameron, the one who existed in the accumulated memories of the people in this room. The child who asked why about everything. The young man who had taken apart a bicycle to see if it worked differently in another configuration and who had been genuinely delighted when it did. The 22-year-old who had spread his first architectural drawings across the kitchen table with the expression of someone who has found the thing they are going to do with their life and who understands exactly how lucky that is. She said, "This foundation is not a monument to what was lost. It is a continuation of what he intended. It is built in the same spirit that informed every drawing he ever made, which was that the places where people live and the institutions that govern their lives should be generous to those who need them most." She announced the foundation's first case. Darnell Reeves, 31 years old, Prince George's County, arrested without cause, 11 days in pretrial detention. Job, lost apartment, lost charges dropped. Record now cleared. Employment reinstated. He was in the room. His name was spoken aloud. Several people who did not know him turned to find him in the crowd, and he nodded, and something passed through the room that was difficult to name precisely, but that had in it something like the specific warmth of witnessing the point of something be proven. The Foundation's waiting list on opening day was 47 cases long. After the ceremony, when the guests had moved to the small adjacent reception, Miriam stayed in the main office alone. She stood by the window that faced Clement Street, the street Cameron had walked to school on, the street where he had fallen off the bicycle for the 5th time and gotten up laughing. And she looked at the November air outside and the light in it, which was the light of a year that had contained everything it had contained, and she let herself be in it without trying to make it into anything other than what it was. She had lost something that could not be replaced. She had built something from the loss that could not have existed without it. Both of these things were completely true, and they did not cancel each other. And standing at the window on Clement Street, she let both of them be true at the same time, which is the only honest way to hold them. 14 months after Glenwood, on a Tuesday in January. Miriam Doyle took her seat at the center of the bench at 10 o'clock in the morning in the courtroom where she had worked for 11 years, and the oral argument before the court that morning was in a case involving municipal liability and civil rights claims. Specifically the standard by which a municipality could be held responsible for the conduct of an officer acting under color of law. The attorney for the petitioning city was Gerald Ferris, a skilled appellate practitioner who had argued before this court 4 times and who had prepared for this argument with the thoroughness of someone who understands what 4 times means and what 5 means. Miriam listened to his opening with complete attention, and at the 7-minute mark she asked a question. The question was 23 words long about the evidentiary standard the city was asking the court to adopt, and it was the kind of question that sounds simple in the asking, and is in fact a door into a room the respondent has not been in before. Ferris answered it with competence. Miriam followed it with a second question that assumed the full implications of his first answer, and his second answer was notably less certain than his first. And when the argument concluded 47 minutes later, the case had moved in a direction that was evident to everyone present, and that Ferris would spend the drive home thinking through carefully. Miriam returned to her chambers. She removed her robe. She rolled up the left sleeve of her blouse as she had rolled it up every morning for 14 months, and she looked at her wrist. The marks were there, faint, subtle, the kind of thing most people would not notice if they were not looking for them, and that she did not need to look for because her body knew exactly where they were. 2 faint, slightly discolored bands of skin at the level of her wrist bone, the permanent residue of steel applied with deliberate force to a woman standing at her son's grave. She looked at them for a moment. She thought about Cameron and the magic trick and the 4th attempt. She thought about the patent delight on his face when it worked. She thought about him at the kitchen table with his drawings, 214 of them spaces designed to be generous to people who had never been given generous spaces, a life's work that would not be built by the person who had imagined it, but that was being built day by day, case by case, in a row house on Clement Street by people who had read the drawings and understood their intention. She rolled her sleeve down. She picked up the next case file. Danny Marsh was completing his 2nd year of law school at the University of Maryland, studying civil rights and constitutional law. He had written Miriam a letter 8 months ago explaining who he was and what he had decided to do and why. The letter asked for nothing. She had written back. In its first year, the Cameron Doyle Foundation for Justice had handled 63 cases, secured dismissals or reversals in 41 of them, and provided representation to 11 people facing wrongful convictions. 2 cases had gone before the state appellate court. One had been won, producing language in the opinion that the state legislature cited 3 months later when passing mandatory body camera legislation for all county law enforcement agencies in Maryland. Darnell Reeves sent a donation from his first full paycheck back $43 in a plain white envelope with his name and the Clement Street address in careful block letters. Miriam opened the next file and began to read. If this story of a mother's unbreakable dignity and the justice that finally found its way back to her moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about people who refuse to be broken. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done standing at that grave when the boots hit the gravel? We read every single one.